Hey, readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and this is Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. My guest this episode is Marina J. Lostetter, author of The Helm of Midnight. With a genre-defying blend of fantasy, thriller, and mystery, this novel follows a regulator named Krona as she investigates the high-profile heist of powerful magical artifacts. The death mask of a notorious serial killer has been stolen, effectively returning him from beyond the grave to murder again. But these are not just random acts of violence, but instead works of a singular, deadly purpose. As Krona and the regulators investigate, what they discover may implicate more than ordinary men and monsters, and the price for these terrible truths may be worse than madness. The first book in the Five Penalties trilogy, The Helm of Midnight, is available now from TOR Books. And Marina, welcome to Fictitious.
Thanks for having me.
This book is really interesting to me because something that we talk about on the show a lot is genre, where things fit into genre, what happens when we mash up genre, how do you pitch things that are mashups, how do you market things that are mashups. And I think that while The Helm of Midnight is your first foray into fantasy, because your previously published novels have been sci-fi, so, you know, big gear shift as far as overall like world building and setting and stuff goes, but you didn't seem content to just write any old normal fantasy when you jumped into it. Instead, you went for full-blown, massive world building, huge development as far as gods and magic system and things that are going to be pretty unfamiliar to even, you know, well-versed fantasy fans. And then you're blending in stuff that feels like thriller, like mystery investigation. There's a little bit that almost touches on steampunk maybe in a way. Yeah, there's a lot going on with the world building here. So I gave a little bit of a description there, but what is your pitch for The Helm of Midnight? How do you describe this novel?
So I like to pitch it as Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn meets Hannibal. That usually gives people a pretty clear idea of what I'm going for. Very structured sort of a magic system, and then obviously there's a serial killer that's very involved in the story. That's how I pitched it originally, actually, to my agent, even I think when I met my agent. So that's a pitch I've been using for a while now. Because yeah, I just kind of was like, I want to go big, right? Let's jump into fantasy with a bang.
Right. You come out swinging. I mean, and I think there's a lot of like by the numbers fantasy out there, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, in the sense of there are some really fantastic stories being written by people that are very much in the Tolkien tradition or the things that have been kind of laid out by all the people post Tolkien. But there's really something to be said for people who take the genre and do something in a twistier fashion. This novel, while it's not even remotely similar to it, the first book that came to mind when I was reading this that I thought of was Foundry Side by Robert Jackson Bennett, in the sense that that's a book that has a heist in it. Your book starts with a heist. It's less heisty in that sense. I feel like heists have been very in vogue in the fantasy world for a few years. Yes, yeah. But your novel's not based around that in that same kind of way that a lot of other ones are. But Bennett's work was really about taking fantasy and almost blending this idea of code into it, into the way the magic system works. Your magic system comes with plenty of costs, which is a thing I'm always interested in. And we're going to really dig into it because as far as the world building, like that's the stuff I really want to tear into with this. Like I said, I mean, you're playing with a lot of different things. And obviously you say like Hannibal, and there's a devoted fan base for Hannibal that also recognize all the elements that's going to imply, whether it's going to be kind of an underlying sense of horror, maybe a little bit of a body horror kind of, gore kind of element to it, but also this kind of twisty, insidious kind of storytelling that's in place in something like Hannibal. And then, of course, obviously Sanderson is known for his intricate magic systems and fantasy storytelling. It does a good job of selling what this concept is. But when you were sitting down with it, were those your core influences that you were thinking about? Because there's also some Eldritch horror kinds of stuff happening here. There's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on. So the story actually started out its life as a short story. And it just focused on the first few chapters of one character, which is actually Melanie, who is she's a main character, but she doesn't appear at first to be very central to the serial killer heist narrative. The way I world build and plot is almost very counterintuitive. It's very backwards. So I kind of begin at the end and then figure out how I got there. So a lot of my influence, like Mistborn definitely was a direct influence. And I think just because Sanderson does do so much super structured magic. Like I love really out there magic where you're not really sure, like it's very loose and wavy, but crunchy magic that like almost has a physics type structure to it, right? That is very like, here are the rules, and there are these people that study it, and there are the people that are, have perfected it. And basically you have, your scientists and engineers, but it's for magic, is really interesting to me because you can do all sorts of things with fantastical physics. And I'd like to see more of that, like, get into the nitty gritty of magic. So I think that first off was a really big influence. And then the original short story did feature a mask. And I think when I started off, I was like, all right, so because all the magic system is based on enchantments, right? That's all object. The masks, which were very prominent in the short story, are death masks that can be imbued with knowledge of the dead. Basically a special skill. If they're an artisan and they want to preserve that skill after they die, they can go through a process of preservation and put that in a mask that somebody can wear and then get their skill. But sometimes personality also gets transferred, and there's different levels of that, and different people have different intensities of personality that might get transferred. And so after I finished the short story and then came back to it to write a novel, I think I was just like, okay, what is like the worst kind of personality you could put in a mask? And I was like, oh, right, a serial killer. That would be a really terrible personality to have to encounter if you need to like use this enchantment. And I just kind of built the plot off of that. So I think that's kind of where I started, where I began when I was putting it all together.
You said that you start off from a short story and then built on it. In that origin, were you really thinking about just like, oh, I have a neat character, neat concept, and I want to play with? Was there specific things you wanted to explore thematically? Because I think this story touches heavily on ideas of trauma and the things the hurts that linger in our background that influence what we can and can't bring ourselves to do. Corona, right, as a character, is somebody who does have a deep-seated trauma in her background that has influenced how she acts and how like people who are close to her handle her in some ways.
Sure.
Particularly her sister, who is, sort of the head of her group of the regulators. And in particular, I think what you've got is interesting, that you have a character who has to use sort of certain magical things to kind of give her additional courage, to give her resolve in the face of some of the things that are triggers for her. And the trauma elements are not exclusive to her by any means. They also figure into the other POVs in this story.
Yeah.
So that's clearly a big thing in there, but was that something that you discovered as you were writing, or were there things that you were kind of seeking to tackle?
I think I did just kind of discover that as I went. Theme tends to be a thing that I kind of realize after the fact, after I've done the first draft. Usually early on, I'm super plot oriented. So I get my plot down first. And then as I'm doing that, I'm building characters to logically interact with the plot. Like, okay, it's a serial killer plot. We need somebody to hunt the serial killer. Therefore, I have quote unquote regulators who are kind of, like really high end, super duper federal agent type people for this world, right? So Corona logically came out of that. And then because we're already dealing with a serial killer, I think I just ended up kind of subconsciously layering that sort of trauma aspect through everything. And hopefully it's trauma aspect that is dealt with in a easy to parse and not overly traumatic to the reader sort of a way. Because I do feel like it's important to look at trauma and to look at the like visceralness of trauma while not traumatizing yourself while you're doing that. Does that make sense? Right?
Oh, yeah.
So I think all those elements just kind of logically knitted together from my starting point of plot. And then thematically, once I got to the end, I went back and you do it on accident and then you go back and do it on purpose, right? So
I like that way of putting it. You do it on accident and you go back and do it on purpose, because I think thematic elements are like that a lot of times. I mean, I think sometimes writers go in there like, oh, I have something I want to talk about. But I think that a good portion of the time, writers discover the things that they need to talk about in the drafting. Oftentimes, especially as your body of work gets larger, you'll find things that reoccur because they're the things that you are most curious about or have the biggest need to interrogate through your writing.
Right.
And so I think as like when you're a newer writer, you're just finding those things out. When you're one of those people like a Stephen King who's been around for forever, you can go through his body of work and be like, oh, there are clearly things that he needs to discuss. because they are there in the story. But let's get into this setting, because we're talking about it from a tonal, like, genre-ish kind of way. As a fantasy setting, I think, when we say fantasy, you say high fantasy or epic fantasy or low fantasy or whatever subgenre you want to get into. The general thinking is sword and sorcery, right? Maybe, dragons and stuff too, like, usually kind of figure into those ideas. In this case, I mean,
Sure.
there's some swords. There's armor.
Yes.
I mean, it's the graphic will have come up earlier, but here's the pretty hardcover, and you can see this is the regulator armor with their gigantic helms and the big horns and stuff that come off of them. Which is a very signature piece for them, and figures into a lot of the story as well, because those helms are important in the way they hide people's faces and their identities and the masks that they wear underneath, because masks are such a big part of this culture, like you mentioned. Can you kind of tell us more about this setting? Thinking about, what is this place, the valley, where this story is taking place? I mean, you have this city, but then there's, kind of a city under the city, and there's a walled aspect around it where there are things being, held at bay by old divine magic. So have I mentioned there's a lot happening? There's a lot happening.
There's a lot happening.
Yeah.
There are lots of layers. So the actual physical world basically is on a planet that is mostly wasteland, at least as far as we know, given the religious story, creation myth that is present in the story. So from their creation myth, basically, their creator entity is the Thallo, and it made a bunch of monsters in a world that was desolate, and then got really bored and made the gods because it couldn't talk to the monsters. And then the gods kind of did their own thing and made humans, and then got very upset when the Thallo's monsters kept eating their poor little frail humans, and were like, what do we do? We got to do something. And the Thallo was like, it's not my fault. You made a wimpy creature, and all of my creatures are eating it. So in order to protect humanity from all of these monsters, the other gods made a valley and then sacrificed themselves on the rim to create a borderland where the monsters couldn't get in. So the actual narrative takes place in the valley, where all the humans are, and on the outside is crazy wasteland. So within the valley, we have 5 city-states that all function with their own individual governments, and they each have a patron god. The actual novel's plotline all takes place in Ludador, which is one of the 5 city-states, and it has several strange levels of government/inhabitants. So underneath the city is the dregs, where essentially that would be the poor and dispossessed live there, people who don't have any above ground identity. It's really its own community. It's very separated from the rest of Ludador as a country and a city, in everything except for the time tax, which is a mandatory tax that everybody has to pay, where at the beginning of life, you have to literally give over some of your time, your life, into the monetary system. So then above the dregs, we have Ludador proper, which runs more or less like some city you might find anywhere from like 1850 to like 1920, depending, because my world building isn't an exact analog. There are some things that seem a little anachronistic that I did on purpose. It's all in there. And then you have not a monarchy, but still a nobility class, basically. And they run the city and are in charge of everything from running the regulators to running the money to, all of the upper class people run all the important stuff, right? And then at the top, you have twins who are actually, if you have a noble twin, those 2 people can run for the highest offices, including the Grand Marquises, who are or Marquexes or Marquis.
I have never known how to say that word.
I know. It's a difficult word. And then also I have 5 different stated accepted genders within the world. So then trying to pronounce all of mine. So the Grand Marquises are then in charge of overseeing Ludador proper.
I like that you mentioned the thing about the twins, because there's an aspect of world building that I like, which is that, like you said, each of the city-states has a patron deity. 4 of the gods are very prescribed and have an identity that is recognized as far as a gender identity, what their power is, as far as almost like an elemental kind of thing. But the 5th one is unknown, which is an interesting aspect in there as well, too. But this city, its patron god is time. Their currency is largely based on time, which is a really fascinating and complicated idea. And I say complicated, not necessarily in the story. It's easy enough to understand in the story, but I think complicated from the standpoint from a writer's aspect. And I'm going to dig into that in a minute, because those are the kinds of things I think are like really super cool ideas that can really trip you up in the construction of a story. But yeah, you do have this time tax, which is something that I think the story both presents as that's just the way it is, and then some of the characters do interrogate as it goes along as well. With these five gods, can you kind of illuminate just a little bit more of that? Because I think that when we're talking about fantasy worlds and thinking about if there is a large divinity aspect to it, that's going to have a huge impact, particularly if it really seems to play into the lives every day. Like in our world, we can talk about the divine, but if people are looking for concrete examples of it, it's a bit nebulous, right? I'm being very careful in how I say this, because as an agnostic, I have to be mindful of how different people feel about these things.
Sure.
But in a fantasy world, it's far more concrete. And this, you know, time is something they can vial and something that they can give to other people. Obviously, the magic of the mask pulls these memories and these personalities and abilities from people. So the magic shows that whatever the source, it's a real thing. So can you kind of just go into that pantheon a little bit further? Because I think it's an important thing to kind of understanding the story and kind of a linchpin of your world building.
Yes. So the five gods are knowledge, time, nature, emotion, and the unknown. And each of those magics corresponds to quote unquote an element, not a literal element, but like knowledge is in wood. So ergo, the mask that they can carve. So there's other things they can do with quote unquote knowledge magic as well, besides make the mask, but that's the type of enchantment that figures heavily in the first novel. Time is related to glass and sand. So therefore they can put it in, windows and jars and all sorts of things like that. Nature magic is kind of more the magic of evolution and transference, and it's in metals. So it's how they really move the magic around and shift the way it's used. Oh, emotions. Emotions are also important. Emotion magic is in gemstones. So different gemstones can be enchanted to hold a different emotion. So for instance, a despair stone figures heavily in the plot of book 1. And then the unknown god is literally unknown in all of their aspects. So nobody knows what their element is. Nobody knows what their magical gift is. Nobody even knows really how to depict that god. All the other gods have specific types of depictions that they get, and this one doesn't have one. And the mystery of the unknown god also figures heavily in the plot.
So from a world building standpoint, one of the things that I always find interesting, or perhaps vexing, is that when you start to build a unique fantasy world and you introduce these kind of elements, you're also introducing yourself to a lot of challenges, because all these things are going to be interconnected. You can't introduce any type of powered object into the world without unbalancing something. It's kind of like somebody on the show a while back had kind of made the point that like part of the problem of a world like Harry Potter is that they have too much magic and not enough cost. And there should be a perfect world. There shouldn't be, nobody should ever get sick. There should never be any problems. There should be no reason to separate themselves from the mundane world, because like there's just too much possibility in that. But it's a story for kids. It's not made to be questioned that heavily, right?
Sure.
When you're writing something for adults, the more involved it gets, the greater chance that scaffolding can collapse if it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And I think that ends up being something that can be a struggle in revisions, in editorial feedback, in beta readers, if people point and go, well, if you have this, why doesn't anybody ever do this? And certainly this story sets up on a number of occasions, here's the rules everybody follows, and then somebody goes, but what if I break that rule? Which can be its own can of worms. So I'm curious for you, as you were writing this, revising it, going through editorial feedback, where were you finding those places where you had to stop and go, oh, well, if this exists, how do people relate to it? How does it change everyday life? How much does it inform their world around them? And where do I have to course correct around those things? Or where does it create plot problems where you can say, oh, this situation should be really, really easy for the character because they have the MacGuffin. And now I have to give them a reason for it to not be easy, that kind of thing. Yeah, are there places in the narrative where that really stood out to you?
I think the time itself, using the time, was one of those moments. Early on, I hadn't given much thought to the connection between, okay, if you're literally using time as money, right? Then all of the rich people have more time and all of the poor people don't have as much time. So that makes sense also for their lifespans, that the rich people should also live very long lives versus the poor people who live quote unquote short lives, or they think that's the more natural length, and then the rich people, are living much longer. So I did have to go back and think really hard about how I had portrayed that, and I had to do some finessing there, which I think was good and important because it, again, luckily feeds right into a lot of the thematic things that I was talking about with building the world and the very, the stratospheres of society and that kind of thing. So the good thing that is useful for me is that each enchantment is very unique, meaning each mask, it has a similar functionality in that, you put on a mask and it has an ability. But each ability is completely different and unique to that object. So in that sense, it was good. It's not like everybody has a mask that can tell you how to do X. So therefore, why isn't X super easy, right? It's only really in this one person's artisan mask. So I think in a way that kind of helps me pull it back because it's not like, oh, everybody has access to an ability. Why is this a problem? If magic is also still an artisan capability and each item has to more or less be crafted individually for an individual purpose, then it's really hard for that to get out of hand.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't a world where like the common person can stand around and just do some prestidigitation and and do regular magic. Like it is, they may get access to magic to these items, and there was something that's introduced through the Melanie character, like you were talking about earlier, who exists in a different timeline or a different time frame, I should say, from the main plot, and we'll get into that in a minute. But I thought it was interesting that she needed to heal her mother, and so she needed to go basically rent the mask of a great healer. And that kind of concept was something that I found really interesting in this, which was that, like, while the common people can't do magic, they can rent it for a price, which is often their own time. And so that you have a world where there are these, like, when we talk about the masks, I mean, every one of them is unique. Every one of them is done differently. Everyone is carved. And I got to think everybody walking around with these things on their faces looks like a loony because like they're so wild, sometimes in the way they look, but it's a common occurrence to see people in them. Not that everybody's just walking around in a mask all the time, but masks are common because of the way the magic works. And so that when people are like, oh, I need access to this thing, it's possible for them to purchase it or rent it. But there's also a challenge with them because some of them are a fairly low level amount of power or a personality that's imbued in it that isn't particularly problematic. And some of them have a much higher level of magnitude and are much more difficult to control. And also the average person has a varying degree of ability in order to allow those things to influence their mind. Melanie shows that she can be overridden by a very low level mask versus our main POV Krona, who has a singular ability to keep control of them. And I thought all of that was very cool. In approaching that stuff with the death mask too, like, are there places where you had to stop and go, and it's not that, well, I mean, they're all death masks because they're taken from people after they're dead. That's got to be kind of creepy for anybody in the world where like you're putting on the face of somebody else. But I mean, and thinking about that again, like how much did you have to interrogate that idea while you were working on this? And from your own constructive standpoint, do you have like a backlog somewhere of like 50 different mask ideas you didn't use that didn't make the story? I mean, how much did you explore that concept?
Oh, I wish I was that organized. Unfortunately, my world building is very messy. So it was much more, the way I approached it was like, what if I did this? Wouldn't that be cool in the moment? What if I did this? Wouldn't that be really cool in the moment? So really, it was less about what kind of masks am I making, because I kind of just like hit a spot in the plot where I was like, I want to use an enchantment. What would be fun here? And I threw it in. then like going back and being like, oh no. I think the actual process of making the mask though was one of the things that I had to go back and look at, because one mask that is a very important mask to the plot is created not in the usual manner. And so I had to make sure that the way that that functioned still made sense within what I'd constructed. And that is one thing about my world building, is a lot of my world building that I've done for the Helm of Midnight, I have done purposely to break it. So I don't know why I've decided I'm going to world build twice, but apparently that's what I'm doing. So one thing about the Helm of Midnight is you get introduced to a world, and then you have the characters, as you pointed out already, that start interrogating the world and how things really work. And you start to see little flaws in what they are told about the system and how these things function. And then as I break that down more, I am filling in new gaps in their place for how things actually work, if that translates and makes sense.
Yeah. And I think from a storytelling standpoint, you have to really put in a lot of societal taboo and rule enforcement to kind of keep people away from effing around and finding out, essentially. Yes. Because, you know, when you have things that if people are walking around with a thing in their pocket, I mean, as valuable as literal time, eventually you're going to have somebody who's going to be like, I don't know, screw it. What if I pop this thing and just throw it in the air?
What if I just do it? Yeah. What's going to happen?
Right. So you have to create constraints of why it's so valuable that somebody will not recklessly mess around and right. just to discover what's going on. And I think that creates a layer of difficulty from the writer's standpoint to like having, you know, having to structure those things out just so nobody sits there afterwards and they're like, but I don't know, if I was sitting around bored enough, sooner or later I would do this. So
I would just do this, yeah.
Right. What would keep me from doing it? A little bit ago, I mentioned that the character of Melanie is in a time frame that's 2 years ahead of the primary plot. Crona is in the present.
Behind.
2 years behind. 2 years behind, yes.
Yeah.
And Crona is in our primary story. And then there is a third POV that feels kind of spoilery to talk about, but I'm not sure.
I think we should. I feel like everybody really enjoys the fact. So some people might be surprised, but the actual serial killer whose death mask is stolen, we get his point of view, which is fun and scary.
Yeah, I mean,
that was 10 years before the main plot line.
Yeah, so you have this character who was like Louis. Is it Charbon, or how do you say that?
You can say his name however you please. Louis Charbon, Louis Charbon. Anything along those lines works for me.
Well, I feel like there's a touch of French here and there in there. So Louis Carbon.
There is a touch of French. Yes.
Yeah. So you have this serial murderer character who's been dead for a while, Louis Carbon. And one person would ask, why in the hell would you make an imbued death mask from a serial killer? So obviously there's got to be a pretty good reason or pretty nefarious reason for that to even exist in the first place, to create this thing of great power that's then held by the state as nobody should have this, but then they want to show it off. That doesn't turn out well for anybody, as you would expect.
No.
But you get that the Hannibal-esqueness of this story is that we get a look into the mind of the serial killer, which I got to think from the writer's standpoint is really fun. Nothing we want to experience in real life, but we'd love to read about it, right?
Yeah.
But so yes, you have 3 different time frames informing this story, 3 primary POVs. There are some other moments where we see from the third person perspective of a couple of other characters to kind of inform a moment here and there a little bit more, but really those 3 primary characters. What informed that decision to do those different time frames? Is that something that you knew from the beginning you were going to do? I mean, I know there was a short story that you were kind of like retrofitting into this as well. Is that kind of how that happened in the first place? Because it's fairly untraditional.
So I had to shuffle some things around. So once I decided to include Louis, who actually was the last point of view that I chose to do, once we decided to keep him, obviously we start off the story more or less, the serial killer was dead to begin with. So we have to backtrack to his life in order to show him. So that naturally was just, okay, it has to be 10 years previous because he's been dead for 10 years. Melanie's storyline at one point was executed in tandem with Crona's. And I found that was not the time where Melanie had the most narrative thrust. She's very important when all the threads come together, and they all come together in Crona's timeline. So you do it towards the end, get a few chapters that are now with Melanie. So I was trying to put everything with her in that timeline. I was like, But what's really important is what happened to her 2 years back. That's the important part of her life and then she goes on and she has a little gap of like, quote unquote, normalcy. And then it basically her past kind of catches up with her in a way. So I thought it was really important to pull that back and put her in the timeline where she does have the most agency. It still has, that's where all the effect on the plot is. So that's where the timeline needed to be.
So with a story that has this much mystery investigation, has this kind of thriller aspect to it, and thinking about the pacing, I mean, you have this much world building. There's a lot to cover, a lot to incrementally delve out so the audience knows what's going on and what they need in a given moment. You know, a lot of descriptions of this have mentioned, again, the heist at the beginning. This isn't paced like a heist novel. It's paced much more with like this sort of deliberate manner of like an investigative story. So I want to touch on how you handled that pacing, thinking about how the information was being, you know, brought to the fore. And also think about the fact that when you've got a story where these different POVs are revealing things, particularly some that are happening 10 years beforehand, there are times where the reader gets pieces of information that our main character and their main POV does not have. And right. We get it ahead of when they do. And that can bring a question of like, what kind of tension does that lose, or what kind of tension does that create for the reader, you know, and being like, oh, I know a thing and I'm waiting for the character to catch up. Right. So thinking about that aspect, like why you made those choices, how that reflects the pacing and all that stuff. And just curious in revisions and editorial feedback too, like how did you manage all of that?
That was very complicated, trying to weave that all together. Because the original short story that was Melanie's, I actually originally had as a prologue before the heist happened. Because that was back when I was doing it in 2 different timelines, you know, so that the beginning of her story was 2 years ago. And then I tried to shoehorn her in with Krona. And that wasn't quite working. So once I actually got her in her proper timeline, I was able to weave their chapters together in a more complementary way, I felt. And I think it was about trying to make sure that the information reveal did build tension and didn't sap tension. Because what I think by the end, there are still things that the audience knows that Krona doesn't, even though she's figured out the main plot, right? And she starts doing her regulator thing. There are still things she does not actually understand about her world and about what happened that the reader definitely has the big picture on. So I think I wanted to make it build tension by doing oh no, I know a thing. Krona doesn't know the thing. It could lead to problems for Krona that she doesn't know this thing, and then watching her try to navigate around that while building the tension of, oh no, if she only knew. So I think that was my main motivator, is to make sure that each chapter, as I'm revealing information, it feels like it's balancing each character's actions and then creating tension of, okay, this is all building towards something, an event.
Yeah. It's kind of like in watching a horror film where you can see the bad guy monster coming, but the characters don't know where he's at, and you're literally screaming at the screen like, "Don't hide behind the chainsaw!
Don't do that!
What are you doing?"
Yeah,
right? Yeah, similar kind
but
of thing.
Hopefully, the character's a little smarter though. Yeah.
Hopefully, yes.
Hopefully, they're doing slightly smarter things.
In thinking about the horror aspect here, again with Louis Carbon, like you have a serial killer. And you know, we're in a moment where like true crime is very much something that people invest a lot of time in. And I say this as somebody who has listened to tons of podcasts and watched documentaries and stuff about these things. They're endlessly fascinating, and at the same time, we have to kind of look at the way that we use those things as entertainment, which is a little weird when it's real life, real world stuff. Here, obviously fictional, but it feels very informed. Feels like you knew what you were talking about when you were approaching these things. So when you're including this kind of darkness in a fantasy story, in an escapism story, things that have that level of mutilation, artful mutilation, I guess is the way to look at it. Yeah. But still, you know, something that's in there. Where do you find yourself writing the line? Where do you find yourself kind of pushing where maybe your comfort zone is, where the audience comfort zone might be? Again, because I'm always interested in where editorial comes in and beta readers and stuff. What was that reaction? Where did it evolve over revisions? Are there any places where you had to stop and go, oh, wow, holy crap, maybe I'm scaring myself here?
I actually have a problem where I want everyone to be too reasonable and too nice in my early drafts. And this has to do with all sorts of conflict. I'm always like, why can't they just talk it out? And that's because talking it out is boring. And so when you're dealing with serial killers, like, okay, it's fine to say he is a serial killer, but if you do not actually display that he is a serial killer, there's going to be a dissonance for the reader. So in my early drafts, when I get my beta reader feedback, it's always like, you need to, I know it's hard, but go further, push more, show more, do more. These people are being too reasonable. They're being too nice. He's a serial killer. He can't be this nice, sort of a thing. So I think hopefully I, again, have displayed the trauma in a connective way that is not where the reader feels it, but is not themselves traumatized by the trauma, because I myself tend to be very sensitive to those things. So as I'm pushing it, I'm pushing myself and trying to figure out where the line is that I would absolutely not be able to cross, and not hitting that line, right? Because it's still, I'm writing for me first and foremost. It feels like, when you want to be a writer, you're telling yourself stories.
Yeah.
But then you want to make sure that you're communicating those stories in an effective manner. So making sure that somebody who has my sensibilities that are basically, why can't we all talk it out, but is giving to the reader, if you're going to pick up a serial killer novel, you want to read about serial killers, right? That's not going to be a surprise to you from the marketing of this book. So making sure that is also delivered on. So I do think I had to push myself forward and make sure I was including that. But also because, again, I'm sensitive to those things, I feel like I didn't go too far because of that.
I think there is something you were talking about there, like that you want your characters to actually have a conversation and be reasonable. I feel like there is a spectrum in storytelling, and that spectrum is, on one end is J.J. Abrams and Lost, where nobody ever says anything to each other about what's going on, and at the
Right.
times when it makes the most sense, they will never ever communicate, which drives the story but makes nothing make sense. And then on the other end is Becky Chambers, who writes stories where everybody has conversations and they figure all the things out, and no plot ever happens because the characters were reasonable and just sat down and had tea and figured out what was going on.
Right. And both things can be great.
Right. I think both can be very compelling, but they are the opposite end of the spectrum from each other.
But they're the opposite end. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. That was the thing. It was like you're writing high epic fantasy investigative adventure, right? So it's got to be adventure-y. There have to be sword fights. There need to be battles. There have to be, people who are running from the law and are fighting the law. And, you got to make sure that everybody is getting out of the novel, that the readers are getting what they're signed up for, right? So if you are signing up for a serial killer in an epic fantasy setting adventure, that's what you want. So you got to make sure you're writing it.
And so, of course, when you have the serial killer, you have to have somebody chasing them. And we have talked only briefly about Krona, who is our main character, but we've kind of danced around her in a lot of ways, and kind of a little bit more about who the regulators are. One thing that I'm always... I never know how to approach in fantasy storytelling is naming, because trying to give things names that make sense, that don't sound like there are 35 different syllables with apostrophes stuck in between in that very classic kind of Tolkien kind of way, that just becomes a nightmare in some fantasy fiction. I got a solicitation for a very popular series the other day, and I laughed my way through the entire premise because the words were so ridiculous. And I was like, I haven't read this series since the first book in 1994, and I don't know what any of these words mean. They're just gobbledygook, right? Versus if you use things that are familiar, you also run a danger of those words already being associated with something. So as soon as I read Regulator, I think of Warren G and Nate Dogg's classic hip hop song from the 90s. When you say the blooming butcher, I think of a blooming onion, and I think about it makes me hungry thinking about Outback, and suddenly I'm like, I don't think that's the reaction I'm supposed to have to the blooming butcher. But of course, every phrase you're going to use, if it means something in the real world, it's going to be loaded and is going to mean something to somebody, and somebody else is going to be listening to right now is like, oh, I was born in 1998 and I have no idea what that song is you're talking about, old man. So, it goes a lot of different directions. But let's talk a little bit more just briefly about Krona and talking about what her place is in this story, what motivates her in this chase, not just because it's her job, but there's clearly more things going on besides that. So what can you tell us about her?
So Krona is fairly new to the team she's on of the Regulators. The Regulators I kind of think of as akin to a white collar division and federal agency. So they're out there basically regulating enchantment use. That's their main function. So hunting down serial killers is not actually Corona's main job. But because she and her team were in charge of the enchantments when the heist went down and they lost the objects, then her search for the actual literal mask gets her involved in the serial killer case. She is very motivated by trying to impress her sister, who is also her boss, which is probably not a great dynamic for most people. Working with family is one thing, and then even having one be your boss is another, right?
A little problematic, yes.
Little problematic. So she's newer to the team. She wants to impress her sister. She wants to be good at her job. She wants redemption for losing the objects. If she can get them back, then she has righted her own wrong. And she also is trying to prove herself in the sense that she has a very specific phobia that at times hinders her performance on her job. And that's of the Vargur, which is the one monster that can get into the valley from outside, are Vargur. And they are terrible things that cannot be killed, that will eat you on sight and just masticate you into a bloody pulp. Basically, she has some childhood trauma related to one that plays into the plot, so I won't spoil that one.
Yeah, I was like, the Varg get talked about very early in the story, so I figured I would like not delve too heavily into them, because you read the first couple of chapters, you will learn about them and the threat that they pose and why the regulators are kind of there to deal with them. Something I did think was interesting in the early parts of this were that the regulars use magic in ways that will feel reminiscent to people of, like you said, when you think of them, this sort of like the white collar federal agent. I mean, inside they wear these big suits of armor and these helms that are tall and cover their heads up entirely. But inside they've got these little beads that they can put in their mouths and then basically communicate with others that have those same beads and those helms, which feels very much like federal agents with the earpieces talking into their wrists. You know, it's got this kind of Mission Impossible-ish kind of thing to it. Some of them have, you know, these plates in their armor that they can tap on and said coded message, and it gets recorded all the city state away, where, you know, code is being written down. Somebody has to translate it afterwards and stuff. So there are elements that feel like you said anachronistic earlier, where there are things where we will recognize some of these elements will feel very current, and yet there is like a sort of serfdom. Elements of this will feel very fantasy familiar to people who read in that genre, but there are also places where you're blending a lot of different stuff. And I think that can cause dissonance for the reader, but in a fun way, where they can stop and be like, oh, okay, like there's a vibe here that I recognize, but we're playing with it in a different way. And I think that kind of thing is really fun. And there's a lot of those elements in here. Because again, very interesting world building, very fascinating place. I was struck by, I was like, oh, this is the kind of book and series, because it's the first in the trilogy, that would easily translate its way into like an RPG. Like that, like you could play this as like a D&D world, because it would give you lots and lots of stuff to play with in it. I could see immediately where I was like, oh gosh, like how you would run this as a game master or something. I think that creates worlds that people will want to run around in their own imagination afterwards, because it gives them enough questions, enough what ifs, enough possibilities outside of the main thread, the main plot line, that afterwards they're going to be like, well, what about this? I think that's a sign of good storytelling. You mentioned earlier, you sort of write a little backwards, and that maybe you were not the most structured writer out there.
No. But I'm a plotter. I'm not a pantster.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Plot twist. So let's dig into that a little bit. What does that process look like for you then?
I'm the most disorganized, nonsensical plotter you probably will ever meet. So basically, as I said, I start off with kind of like a concept for my plot, and then I will have an image in my head of kind of like the ending scene, you know, somewhere towards the end. It doesn't have to be the very last scene. And then I kind of just deconstruct how we got there. And so once I start doing that, I'll just open up a Word document and just do like total train of thought nonsense. That is just streaming, like, what if this happened? Then that happened. This could happen. That would be cool. And anybody who went back to read it would not be able to tell what was going on, because lots of it is just like spur of the moment thing that I instantly discard after I type it, but I know in the document what I want to save and what's good and what's not in that. And then I might make myself like a basic bullet point, like this has to happen, then this has to happen, and this has to happen, and it'll be like super short. And then if I'm, depending on if I've already sold the novel or if I'm pitching the novel, I might do an actual like full on like TED page write-up of a very nice, clean, this happens, then this happens, and this happens sort of a thing to hand over so that somebody else knows what's happening in my brain. And then from there on, it's a lot of just Word. I work like 95 to 99% in Word. And then everything else is just like random little notes on sticky pads and notebooks and things like that. So I'm a plotter, but not an organized one.
Some people will watch this on YouTube. Some of them will be hearing it as a podcast. So the ones who are listening to the audio only version, like you're in this very tidy, neat environment. The writing does not sound that way. So
okay.
I'm like,
yes, this is kind of a false picture because to my right over here is a window that was just replaced. So my office is very clean because I had to clean it out for someone to come in and do window replacement in my office. So it is giving you a false picture of what this place usually looks like.
Well,
because
it made for a great set, though.
Oh, good. I do usually like try to push everything out of the way whenever I have to be on camera in here. I'm like, you can't actually see all the mess, but usually it's just like right outside the peripheral.
It's all about framing, just like
all
in a novel,
about framing. Yep.
Where all the work is hidden, behind all the chaos of notes and revisions and everything, and people just get what we want them to see, not everything that was left on the cutting room floor. So
right.
that makes sense. That tracks. Do you use any kind of plotting system? Is there any kind of particular framework that you touch on? And there's classically in 3 and 4 act, but there's a lot of other different ones. Anything like that figure in?
Not usually. I might make up my own structure within the thing, meaning like, so I have another book coming out this year called Activation Degradation at Sci-Fi. And that I very distinctly was like, this is a 5-part structure. I have 5 parts and there's 5 chapters in each part. And it just happened that way. Like my brain just was like, I'm going to divide it this way. That's what you get now. But I can't really, I'm not the sort of person who can force myself to a structure, right? If somebody was like, here is the save the cat structure, write a story to this structure, I would fail miserably. So I can create my own structure for totally impulsive reasons, but usually it's not I'm trying to follow a format that pre-exists.
So this book just came out. You do have that new one coming out, like you were just talking about. This is the first in a trilogy. What's the kind of release schedule? Do you know, how quickly these are going to be coming out?
I don't know. I think we were originally looking for 1.5 years from, but I have not yet turned in the second one, to be honest. So
publishing has seemed to be accelerating as far as how quickly, particularly like when you've got things that are a trilogy, there seems to be a little bit more of a push to get entire series out within like 1.5 years, because reader expectation seems to have become that a lot of times some people are adventurous and they're like, cool, new thing and more to look forward to. Other ones are like, I'm not touching a trilogy until all 3 books are out. And which of course is not super helpful to the writer and the publisher. No. And you're like, we kind of need you to buy this thing now, right? If you want more of it, like you kind of need to pick it up.
Yeah.
So there is that sense of reassuring when you're like, okay, you get this one and the next one's 6-8 months later or something like that. So, but
I mean, you are definitely getting all 3. That contract is signed. So there's no like, oh no, if it doesn't sell, we're doing them all. So rest assured, that's happening.
Well, and as a novel, this both functions in a standalone way where you're not going to feel like you didn't get the whole story, but at the same time, it leaves lots and lots of questions. So there are plenty of things from the world where you're like, oh, there's a lot more to be resolved. There's a lot more story to tell, but you do get a wrap up as far as like what the primary plot
is. That's really important to me in terms of my like narrative philosophy. Like if you're going to do a book one, I really feel it needs to be a self-contained story that somebody can be one and done if they want to be one and done. And then the next ones are for people who are like, oh, I must explore the world further and see how the plot thickens. Because I feel like most readers, if they're going to pick up a book, you want a whole story in the book, right? So.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, there's There was a book that I recommended to one of the people in my writing group not too long ago, and then we got onto a writers meeting, and my friend was like, "Hey, I'm mad at you." I'm like, "Why?" And she's like, "Well, you recommended this book, and it was great, but it ended on a cliffhanger, and the second book isn't out yet. How dare you?" And of course, and I was like, the second book isn't out yet, but I have it right here, So I mean, that's, the weirdness of being on a different timeline as far as a content creator or, writers stuff too, where you get access to them ahead of time. So, but she was not pleased with me, and I hadn't even thought about it when I recommended it. I was like, oh no. But yeah. But, well, we know that more is coming. Again, this will work for people who are looking for a standalone. The Helm of Midnight is out in hardcover now, which is very, very attractive. Good shelf appeal, I think. This stands out. It's good design. That always matters. I'm a graphic designer, so those things matter to me. Where should people be following you online? Where should they keep up with your various shenanigans, learn about where your next, when your next books are coming out, what series you have, getting introduced to the sci-fi and stuff too, all that?
I am on Twitter at Marina Lostetter, and my website is at www.lostetter.com. Those are my two main things. I also have an Instagram account, which I believe is at Marina J Lostetter. It might be at Marina Lostetter, but I'm pretty sure the J is in there. I, once in a blue moon, will post a photo on there, usually of a book.
It is hard to be in all the places. I don't know how anybody does it. The job of a writer is tough enough without also being, I don't know, funny or engaging, or, to look at like the Chuck Wendigs of the world that are like really, really good at Twitter somehow, or the people who are, I don't know, it's like, if you're familiar with Jen Lyons, like posts really cool Instagram stuff, and she's really artsy and things like that. And I'm like, where do you find the time to do any? I don't even understand. But, we all have our creative energy, and we focus them in different ways. So, just
her
use your powers for
signature is
good.
Crazy too.
That seems like a lot of work, right? Especially if you have to sign a whole lot of books.
It's beautiful. It's her whole name. It's like it's her author signature is a work of art.
I'd be impressed if she can sign 500 books in a row and it still looks like that. But it sounds like hand cramp city to me. But she also has beautiful penmanship. So yeah, you're totally right on that. Well, Marina, thank you so much for joining me on this. I hope people check this book out. There's a lot to chew on here, especially for world building junkies, for writers and readers who are looking for a unique, well-developed world full of questions and answers and more questions that they can really dive into and run around in their heads. I think this is the one for it. And thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
Yeah, thanks for having me.